It was April 5, 1900, on the island of Crete. The British archaeologist Arthur Evans lifted something out of the earth. It was a clay tablet no bigger than 2 finger joints, and on its surface was a script no one had ever seen. Evans understood almost at once. What he had found was not one object, but an entire lost civilization. The Minoans, the kingdom of King Minos from Greek myth. The tablets Evans unearthed soon numbered in the thousands, and among them were 3 completely different writing systems. Evans gave them names: the pictographic hieroglyphs, Linear A and Linear B. None of the 3 could be read by anyone alive. And Evans declared one more thing. This was absolutely not Greek, he said, but the language of the Minoans, far older than Greek. Any attempt to read it as Greek would be wasted effort. Evans barely shared his transcripts with other scholars. He was convinced the script could not be solved within his lifetime. For 50 years, Linear B lay sleeping. In 1941, Evans died. But Linear B remained as silent as ever, and no one could find a thread to pull. Then, one day, the story moved across the Atlantic to America. There, a woman quietly began to stake her whole life on this problem. Alice Kober was a professor of classics at Brooklyn College. By appearance an ordinary scholar, she had one thing none of the famous men had: sheer persistence. Every night at her desk, Kober did the same unglamorous thing. She copied every sign from every tablet onto index cards, and in the end, she made 400,000 of them. And then she made the discovery everything else would rest on. She found the same words repeating again and again, identical at the front and changing only at the end. What did that actually mean? Think of a language like Korean, where mukda, mukgo, and mukji share one stem and shift only at the ending. Kober had found exactly that inside Linear B. And here came Kober's true genius. She began arranging those endings into a grid, consonants along one axis and vowels along the other. Any 2 signs in the same column had to share a consonant, even though she had no idea which one. That grid changed everything. It proved the signs were neither letters nor pictures, but syllables, each one standing for a consonant joined to a vowel. In 1950, Kober published her grid, more than a decade of work. And in that very same year, she died of lung cancer at the age of 43. Kober died without ever seeing the answer. But the grid she made survived her, and it landed on the desk of a young Englishman. His name was Michael Ventris. He was not a scholar and held no university post. By profession, he was an architect. The moment that decided Ventris's life came when he was 14. On a school trip to a museum in 1936, he happened to hear Arthur Evans himself lecture on the Knossos tablets. At the end of the lecture, the 14-year-old raised his hand and asked whether the script was really not Greek. The old scholar smiled and answered that, "No, my boy, it is not Greek." In that one exchange, the boy's life was decided. From that day, Ventris worked on Linear B nearly every night. He was a brilliant student who spoke 6 languages, but he read architecture at university, not classics. And that is exactly what left him free of academic authority. In 1950, Ventris read Alice Kober's final paper. Her grid unfolded on his desk beside his drafting tools, and the table she had left behind began to come alive again in his hands. In the spring of 1952, Ventris settled on a single hypothesis. Some words must repeat on the tablets far more often than others, and those words would turn out to be place names. That reasoning was, in fact, exactly Champollion's. 130 years earlier, he had guessed at the royal names ringed inside the cartouches, and Ventris was guessing at town names, repeating on clay. The intuitions of decipherers travel remarkably similar roads. So Ventris started guessing in earnest. The most important city in Crete was Knossos, the palace where the tablets were found, with a small harbor of Amnisus below it, and the village of Telemachus further inland. And then the magic happened. Knossos came out as Konoso, Amnisos as Aminiso, and Tylissos as Turiso. All three names dropped into place on Cobra's grid with nothing left over. Once those three readings were locked down, Ventris could start filling the empty cells of the grid. K came from KO, N from NO, S from SO, and the vowel O ran down the whole column. As each sign fell, every other sign sharing its consonant fell with it. But somewhere in the middle of that work, Ventris's hand stopped moving. Something very strange was happening on the page. The words he was unlocking were starting to sound like words he had seen somewhere before. On the 28th of June, 1952, 1 week before his 30th birthday, Ventris cracked the last word he needed. The instant he read it, 50 years of unquestioned authority collapsed. It was Greek. Let us walk through the words Ventris unlocked, one at a time. These are ordinary, everyday words, pressed into wet clay by Greek speakers 3,000 years ago. The first example is Konoso. Just three signs, the one that reads KO, the one that reads no, and the one that reads so. Put them together and you have Knossos, capital of the Minoan world and city of the labyrinth. The second example is where Ventris was genuinely shaken. The word was Teripo, 3 syllables, and the moment he remembered a line of Homer, everything became clear. Teripo is trypos, the very word Homer sings in the Iliad, the 3-legged bronze cauldron the Greeks offered to their gods. And here it was on a tablet 400 years older than the poet himself. The third example is Wanaka. This word appears in Homer in exactly the same form, Wanax, not merely a ruler, but the king above the kings, the supreme power in the land. And beside those titles, the tablets recorded how many sheep went to this man and how much oil to that one. They were the account books of a Mycenaean palace. Not heroic poetry, but real administrative records. The fourth example is Pomi, 2 syllables, Greek poimen, shepherd. If there is a king in these records, there must also be a people, and among that people, the occupation recorded most often was shepherd. The tablets did not stop at the job. They wrote the shepherds down by name, Comowens and Politus. This is the moment the names of ordinary men who walked behind sheep 3,300 years ago finally reached us. The fifth example is KOWO and KOWA, 2 short words differing in a single final vowel. Kowas means boy and Kowa means girl, exactly as Greek has them, so how did these 2 turn up on the tablets? Beside the name of one woman on a palace work roster stood 3 boys and 2 girls. It was a family record, a mother who worked in the palace, and the 5 children fed from her ration. It is the trace of one woman living with her children 3,300 years ago. The sixth and last example is where the names of the gods came through. Dawi was Zeus, and Poseidao was Poseidon. Atana was Athena, and Ira was Hera. The Olympians Homer would one day sing of were already there on clay 500 years before he was born. Once the words came clear, the sentences came clear. And once the sentences came clear, a whole tablet could be read. Once the tablets could be read, the entire Mycenaean age woke out of silence. And we came to understand that Greek civilization did not begin with Homer at all. On the 1st of July 1952, Ventris went on BBC Radio, and he announced to scholars across Britain that Linear B is Greek. At first, the scholarly world flatly refused to believe him. Almost no one was willing to accept that a 30-year-old architect had solved what 50 years of experts could not, and had reached the very conclusion Arthur Evans denied his whole career. Then in 1953, the Cambridge classicist John Chadwick set out to check the decipherment line by line. Chadwick was a genuine specialist in early Greek, and after a month of testing, his conclusion came down to 3 words: Ventris is right. In May 1953, the two men published a joint paper, and on that day, the consensus of half a century gave way. An architect of 30 and the scholar who had set out to refute him had overturned 50 years of authority. But the real shock of this decipherment had nothing to do with the script itself. It was the discovery that the history of Greece would have to be rewritten. Homer, author of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the beginning of Western literature, lived around the 8th century before Christ. But the Linear B tablets belonged to the 13th century, 500 years earlier. And what does that mean? The Trojan War that Homer sang of, Achilles and Odysseus, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae. The possibility opened that those heroes were not Homer's invention, but real people in a real kingdom. And there was something more astonishing still. Among the personal names on the tablets stood names from Homer's poems, spelled exactly as he sings them: Hector and Achilles. Homer had been singing of an age 500 years older than his own, carried to him through centuries of memory. And Linear B became the proof that that age had truly existed. But this story still holds one more cruel turn. For the young man who deciphered Linear B at 30, the 28th of June 1952 was not only a triumph. Exactly 4 years and 2 months later, on the night of the 6th of September 1956, Ventris was killed in a car accident on a road outside London. The time he was given after the decipherment came to 4 years and 2 months. Coincidence? 130 years earlier, Champollion cracked Egyptian hieroglyphs and was dead 9 years later at 41. And Kober died at 43 in the very year she published her grid. There seems to be something like a curse on those who unlock scripts. Just before Ventris died, the book he wrote with Chadwick went to the printers at Cambridge. It was published 3 weeks after his funeral, and he never saw the book of his own life. But the cruelest turn in this story is something else. Ventris is remembered in books and films, and Chadwick too, as the verifier, and yet one name has been very nearly erased. Alice Kober built the grid, and Ventris credited her by name on the very first page of his own book. Scholars say to this day that she would have deciphered Linear B herself had she lived another 5 years. And yet the decipherment is remembered under one name only: Ventris. So at least here, in this video, let us say her name once more. Alice Kober, born in Hungary in 1906 and dead in New York in 1950, the real hero of the decipherment of Linear B. The history of decipherment is archived in SCRIPTA, script by script. You can follow who read what and on what evidence alongside the primary sources. In 1900, a British scholar found a clay tablet, and for 50 years he insisted it was not Greek. In 1947, an American woman built a grid from 400,000 cards and died without seeing the answer. In 1952, a British architect solved it, and he was dead 4 years later. But the script those three unlocked brought us the daily life of Mycenae, 3,300 years on. One person's authority can hold the truth back for 50 years, but one person's persistence can bring that authority down. And the names of those who did the real work are forgotten unless we choose to say them. Alice Kober. If this video meant something to you, please subscribe and like.